Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And I'm going to warn you right off the bat. Things get pretty grim in this discussion because we're going to talk about the events of the 20s and the 30s, the economic and political events leading up to the coming of the war itself. And along the way, we're going to talk about impossible workers' utopias, a man named Joe Steele fighting in the streets, the most beautiful and the most depressing musical ever written, and a single lonely voice of reason and dissent. We're going to follow that outline right up above my little yellow box. So put that in your notes to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow as we begin to build an answer to a single big question there on the lower left. Evaluate FDR's Germany First policy. What was its goal? What did it cost? What did it lead to? Were Marshall and King right, or even half right? In light of how the Second World War developed, was Germany First a wise decision, especially given the alternatives? How did it shape the post-war world? Now, in the 1930s, the Great Depression hit America like a truck. It utterly shattered the economy, it deeply altered the social fabric, and it almost tore the political structure of the nation apart. The economy contracted by a third, unemployment topped 25%. People began to starve in the big American cities. The Great Depression is the largest existential crisis in American history, second only to the Civil War itself. And that's just not me being hyperbolic. The political structure of the United States itself almost collapsed. There was a socialist dictator who took over the state of Louisiana. That's Huey Long right up above my head. On the streets of Washington, D.C., the regular army fought it out with the old veterans from World War I. Around virtually every major city, you saw those things on the upper left. Huge shanty towns called Hoovervilles. And in the center of the nation formed a huge new desert, the Dust Bowl. The Great Depression shattered American confidence and almost destroyed our political institutions. But the thing we need to remember is that the Great Depression was a worldwide phenomenon. It was not limited to the United States. And economic collapses spread all across the world, crashing economies from Canada to the UK to France to Spain and beyond. Across the world, banking systems failed, economies contracted, unemployment soared, social structures strained at the misery, and political systems began to fail all across Europe. Those aren't starving Americans right up above my head. Those are starving Englishmen. That on the upper left, that's the decline of the British economy. The Great Depression was a worldwide event, except there seemed to be two nations that were largely unaffected by the worldwide depression, largely because they had sealed themselves away from the world economy. And both of these nations were ruled with absolute force, complete ruthlessness, and command economies. These two countries that seemed to, be unaffected by the Great Depression were Soviet Russia and fascist Italy. Now, both of these nations arose from the chaos resulting at the end of the First World War. And we're going to look at each of these in turn, starting with Soviet Russia, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, the USSR emerged from the end of the First World War as the old Russian Empire collapsed into this very, very messy four-way civil war. Now, the Reds, or the Bolsheviks, eventually won like most of that civil war, led by their leader, a guy named Vladimir Lenin. And the Soviet Russia eventually coalesced around the core of the old Russian Empire, although they ruled over a much diminished country, and they longed to restore the power of that old 19th century Russian Empire. Now, Vladimir Lenin had never been a particularly healthy individual. That's him on the far left. Now, he dies in 1924, and his death leaves this power vacuum inside the Communist Party of Soviet Russia. And there's a 3-year power struggle after the death of Lenin, and it ends with the ascendance of that guy on the right, a man named Joe Steele, or in Russian, Joseph Stalin. Now, Soviet Russia itself was built on the ideology of international socialism or communism. Now, international socialism held that class consciousness transcended national boundaries. A steelworker in Germany basically had more in common, they argued, than a coal miner in Wales than they had with either the owner of the coal mine or the owner of the steel mill. They were both workers. They had more in common with each other than they had with the ruling capitalist bourgeoisie. Now, the idea is ultimately that the people must collectively own the means of production. The coal miner should own the coal mine. The steel worker should own part of the steel mill. And this is to be administered by the party of the people, the Communist Party. So you have the workers join the party, and the party controls the government. That's how it was supposed to work. The idea behind international socialism was that the current world system of capitalism was ultimately doomed, as the workers of the world realized their need to form communist parties and then seized control of their respective governments. Now, there was going to be a single party across international boundaries, but under that single party, the Communist Party, you would have multiple governments. So you have one huge international party, and the party rules multiple governments across the planet, hence international socialism. Now, eventually, they argued, this is scientific economy. This is a scientific social science. And the struggle for international socialism would be won. And ultimately, when the Communist Party controlled all of the governments of the world, this would bring about a communist utopia, a workers' paradise. But to bring about this paradise, heavy prices would have to be paid. International socialism is not joking around. It is out to literally remake the world into a workers' utopia. And the new ruler of Soviet Russia, Joseph Stalin, was determined to bring this about in Russia at all costs. The first step was the widespread industrialization of Soviet Russia itself. Factories began to be constructed at great cost, and the Soviet state would fund the construction of these huge new factories through the widespread seizure of private property. When the government needed money, a particular group of people would be declared enemies of the state, enemies of the people. All of these people would be arrested, they would be executed, and their property seized and then used to construct part of the new industrialized Soviet Russia. Using his feared secret police, the NKVD, Stalin ordered millions of people murdered, millions of more people arrested and sent to these prison camps called gulags. Poles, Germans, Ukrainians, this invented category called kulaks, and many, many more people were simply liquidated and their property seized and then used to fund the ever-growing Soviet state. Soviet Russia became a country run by state terror. People terrified of being arrested in the middle of the night by the terrifying NKVD. And that's them right up above me. Everyone was terrified of the knock at midnight, and it would be the NKVD come to take you away. And if you were lucky, you would just have 5 or 10 years in prison. If you were unlucky, you would be shot in the head in a prison cell. But the really messed up thing is that it worked, all right? Slowly, Soviet Russia began to do something it had never done before. It began to industrialize. Before, the old Russian Empire had been mostly an agrarian country, but this new Soviet Russia was slowly becoming an industrial powerhouse. These huge new factories began to rise all across Russia. If you look at that chart on the left, that is the growth of the Soviet state. It is growing. Their economy is industrializing, but it is coming at a terrible, terrible cost because Stalin is a true believer and he knows he's got to sacrifice millions of people to bring about the workers' utopia. And he's not afraid to do it. And he kills millions of people. He needs hard currency to build these factories. So he goes into the Ukraine and he seizes all of their food and all of their cattle and everything they need. And he sells it on the international market, leaving the people of the Ukraine to starve. 6 million people die in a targeted government-created famine called the Holodomor. And huge numbers of people die. Poles are liquidated. Entire peoples are uprooted from one part of Russia and told to go live in another. Millions of people die by the orders of Joseph Stalin because he is determined to bring about the workers' utopia and the industrialization of Soviet Russia. Now, we're going to move on to fascist Italy. Now, the Kingdom of Italy after World War I was left in complete shambles. Even though it had actually been on the winning side, inside the Kingdom of Italy, the loss of life in the First World War and the heavy expenditures during the war had basically ruined the country. It was completely impoverished by the end of the war. The elected leaders had lost any kind of actual support from the people. To actually keep the entire country afloat, Italy had to borrow huge amounts of money from Britain and France, and it had to accept very, very modest territorial gains from the end of the war. And the people of Italy were absolutely outraged. They're like, we lost millions of soldiers in this conflict, and that's all we got? All we got was a little bit of land along the Adriatic and huge debts that we owe to the French and the British? This is absolutely outrageous. Italian nationalists were outraged at what they termed the mutilated victory of the First World War. And among these people that were incredibly outraged was a World War I veteran and former socialist leader, Benito Mussolini. Now, Mussolini rapidly gathered support among his fellow veterans, and in 1922 they marched on Rome itself, seizing it and forcing the king to declare Benito Mussolini the prime minister of Italy. Now, once in power, Mussolini began gathering power to himself, becoming a dictator in all but name. He began to reorganize Italy along the principles of something they called fascism. And that's their flag, the blue flag of fascism you see up there. He actually tried to make the blue flag of fascism the official flag of Italy, but the king wasn't having it. Now, Mussolini had actually started out as a socialist. He believed in the same things that Joseph Stalin had believed in, but he had grown incredibly disillusioned with international socialism. The idea that different people in different countries could bring socialism together made no sense to him, especially given what he had seen in the First World War. Now, remember that international socialism held that class consciousness transcends national boundaries, and that a German steelworker has more in common with a Welsh coal miner than either of them have with either the factory owner or the guy who owns the coal mine. And the First World War proved that idea to be completely false, because in the First World War, that German steelworker gladly shot that Welsh coal miner under the orders of the guy who owned his steel mill. So Mussolini says, no, class consciousness does not extend across national boundaries. Rather, you should build socialism within a particular country. Socialism should be built around special, unique nations, strong nations, awesome nations, nations with a special destiny in history, nations like Italy. So, international socialism, communism, according to Mussolini, does not work. It cannot work, and it should rather be replaced with national socialism or fascism. All of Italian society should be reorganized along these fascist principles, and that the Italian people should own the means of production. But instead of belonging to a party that then controls various governments, the Italian people are going to be represented by a single strong leader. And that's what Mussolini said needed to happen. And that's what Mussolini made happen. And of course, that single strong leader is Mussolini himself. He begins to adopt this persona of the leader, or in Italian, El Duce. Mussolini drops the suits of politicians and bankers, and he begins wearing military uniforms, often with a steel helmet. And they codify these fascist beliefs in this book, theoretically written by Benito Mussolini, even though he probably didn't write it. His name was just attached to it. And this is the doctrine of fascism. And the doctrine of fascism is best exemplified by that quote up above my head, supposedly written by Mussolini, but yeah, probably not. At any rate, this is what Mussolini says about the doctrine of fascism. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. Inside the doctrine of fascism, the individual exists only to serve the state, and the state is going to take care of the Italian people. All right. And this is a very, very different thing from, traditional liberalism, the kind of political philosophies of Thomas Paine or Thomas Jefferson, to traditional American democratic ideas. The state exists to serve the individual people, not in fascism. In fascism, the person exists only to serve the state, only to serve that single leader, and he knows what is best to control the government and look after the interests of the Italian people. Mussolini outlaws all other parties. He seizes control of the economy. He forces profits into the state. He does allow some private property, but ultimately everything belongs to the state. He turns Italy into a police state, ruled over by his own secret police, the much feared black shirts. And they put up these big spooky posters all over Rome and all over Italy, because the only candidates that are allowed are fascist candidates. And you don't vote for candidate A or candidate B in Mussolini's Italy. You just have a candidate and you vote either yes or no. So they would make these huge placards like you see up there where it just says yes, which in Italian, sì, 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 sì. And of course, because the only people that would vote are people who support the fascist state, you would have these fascist candidates who would win with 85, 90, 95% of the vote. It is a democracy in name only. And here's one of the things I want to stress to you, that international socialism, communism, and national socialism, fascism, are really just two different expressions of the same thing. They're two different sides of the single coin. They are these authoritarian collectivist philosophies where the individual exists either to serve the party or the individual exists only to serve the state or the leader. All right. And these different types of socialism, whether it's national socialism or international socialism, all of these things hate the old liberal democracies of the West. But the thing they hate even more than the old liberal democracies of the West are each other, because each of these different types of socialism are striving to become the dominant political structure on earth. And to the battered societies of the West, France, Britain, Spain, America, these countries that had been just absolutely battered by the Great Depression, fascism and communism start to sound pretty good. They prove to be these really attractive solutions to the economic and political problems of the 1930s. People in America were like, wow, Mussolini is doing great things in Italy. People in Britain were like, holy cow, Soviet Russia is doing way better than we are. And these political movements attracted angry, unemployed men and women. And they joined these street gangs that then proceeded to go to war with their rivals. And the pictures you see around me, these are not communists in Russia. These are not fascists in Italy. Those are English fascists there on the left. And above me, those are English fascists fighting with the police all across England. And in fact, all across Europe, these street gangs went to war. They had these violent clashes between fascists and communists, between the fascist street gangs and the communist street gangs. And these clashes become more and more common, and both of them are fighting with police and fighting with the structures of liberal democracies who are basically just trying to keep the peace and hold their crumbling nations together. These street gangs, either fascist or communists, they seized weapons, they built barricades, they started to murder one another in the streets, they infiltrated peaceful protests, they battled with the police, and this further destabilized these already shaky liberal democracies, these governments that they already despised. And they had no problem with destabilizing these economies. To the fascists or the communists, these old liberal democracies were yesterday's news. They are something belonging to the past, and it's better they die quicker than slower. Because both the fascists and the communists were very sure of the rightness of their cause, and countries with weak democratic traditions proved especially vulnerable. America did pretty good, but by the 1930s, America's democracy is, almost 200 years old. Not so in different parts of Europe, and definitely not in countries with very weak democratic traditions. Countries like Weimar Germany. The democracy in Weimar Germany was less than a decade old, and the Great Depression devastated the German economy. If the Great Depression hit America like a truck, the Great Depression hit Germany like 10 diesel locomotives. With the failure of the American banking system, the German economy lost all liquidity. Because remember, going back to the days of Calvin Coolidge and the Dawes Act, the German economic structure was tied into the stability of American banks. And when American banks failed in the Great Depression, the entire German economy started to fall apart. The German economy lost all liquidity. Businesses failed across Germany and unemployment soared. It hit 20%. It hit 25%. Then by 1933, the unemployment rate in Germany passed 30% unemployment. Without a solid banking system, the Weimar German government couldn't borrow money, and fears of the old hyperinflation after World War I prevented them from devaluing their currency. The different pressures and forces pulling on Weimar Germany were tearing the country apart. And then came the communists and the fascists. The streets exploded in violence across Germany. They became a battleground for all of these violent political factions. The German communists, that's them right up above me, they were called the KDP, and they called for the destruction of the democracy and for a communist uprising to imitate or even possibly join the Soviet Union. And they were backed by Soviet Russia. And the KDP attacked police, they bombed newspapers that were critical of Stalin, they murdered politicians, they fought openly with rival fascist street gangs all across Germany. Street battles between the German communists, the KDP, and the German fascists, the NSDAP, became commonplace. And there you've got a photograph of one there on the upper left. They're fighting with fists, they're fighting with clubs, they're fighting with knives, and occasionally gunfights are going to break out across these streets, and you never know when it's going to happen. The government could not keep the peace, and it couldn't even afford to hire more policemen. And because of the Treaty of Versailles, it couldn't even enlarge the army to sort of settle down these German cities. So in desperation, the German government turned to volunteer groups of war veterans in an attempt to keep the peace. And these people became known as the Freikorps. And that's the Freikorps right up above me. These former war veterans from World War I, equipped, unpaid, largely on their own recognizance, driving around these little makeshift armored cars and tanks around the German city. With a failed economy, commonplace street violence, ineffective government, armed men with their homemade tanks patrolling the streets that answered to no one, the German people simply wanted it to all slow down. The German people just wanted peace and security. They wanted somebody to take charge. They wanted somebody to take out all of this violence from the street. They wanted somebody to actually tell the Freikorps what to do. They wanted somebody that would make the street gangs go away. They wanted somebody to settle down the economy. They were willing to trade democracy for security. And this is where we meet the NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. I'm going to botch their name in German, but you have to understand their name in German. It is the National Sozialiste Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. Okay? National Socialist. National Sozialist. And that was often shortened. National Socialist. N-A-Z-I. The Nazis. Led by a charismatic speaker named Adolf Hitler, the NSDAP promised to bring order to Germany. They promised to fix the economy. They promised to drive out the communists. And they promised to restore German honor and prestige. And their people began to sign on to this. Due to their very close ties with the Freikorps, the NSDAP delivered on many of those promises. because they absorbed the Freikorps into the Nazi Party. They drove the communists from the street, arresting some, killing others, but mostly absorbing them directly into the ranks of the Nazi Party. In the 1932 German elections, the NSDAP swept into power with 33% of the total vote. Hitler became the German chancellor in January of 1933. And then, just like Benito Mussolini down in Italy, Hitler started to shut down democracy from the inside. And in fact, that 1932 election, that would be the last Germany-wide election for the next 58 years. Some people couldn't take it. To some people, the battling between the communists and the fascists, and watching the Nazis slowly take over their country, watching streets being patrolled by, armed men in homemade tanks, watching their entire country fall apart under economic ruin. And a lot of people wanted nothing to do with this. A large number of Germans just checked out and indulged in complete and total escapism. They wanted to escape all of this violence and uncertainty and poverty. And they did it. They escaped inside these raucous clubs called cabarets. And inside these cabarets, they would just lose themselves in dance and drink and drugs and sex. And they would just have these wild parties that would go on for days. And then they would go back to work and just kind of keep their head down until the weekend rolled around. And then it was time to go back to the cabaret. And inside the cabarets, they didn't have to worry about communists. They didn't have to worry about people starving to death. They didn't have to worry about economic ruin. They didn't have to worry about these scary Nazis. And to a large number of Germans, the cabaret provided this escape. But the problem is, as people just checked out of the political system, this just fed more and more power to the Nazis as they slowly began to take over the entire country. Now, one of the really unusual things about these cabarets is one of the great British writers was present during this time. He was in Berlin in the mid to late 1930s, and his name was Christopher Isherwood, and he wrote probably one of the most fascinating histories you'll ever read about one of the strangest and most depressing times in world history, because there is his great book, Goodbye to Berlin. And he's writing about how people are just trying to escape all of the horror unfolding on the streets and losing themselves in dance and drink and drugs and sex inside these cabarets. And as the Nazis slowly took over the country, the parties inside the cabaret grew more frenetic and more frantic and more than a little crazy, because they knew that the world was changing forever and Germany was changing into something much, much more horrible than it had been before. And this is one of the phrases taken from Christopher Isherwood's history. There was a cabaret, and there was a master of ceremonies, and there was a city called Berlin in a country called Germany. And it was the end of the world. And Christopher Isherwood had something happen to him that few historians can say, which is they took his history books and they turned it into one of the most depressing and most beautiful musicals ever written, Cabaret. And if you've never seen Cabaret, you really should. There's a great version from the 1970s starring Liza Minnelli. And basically what they did with Cabaret is they took a history book and turned it into this beautiful musical. It's got beautiful songs. It's got beautiful dances, usually involving very attractive looking people. But ultimately, the theme of Cabaret is that the escapism that people sought inside these crazy clubs, ultimately, it didn't work. And people just throw themselves into ever cycling and ever more depressing and ever more self-destructive cycles of drugs and sex and dance and alcohol, because what's going on outside the cabaret is just too horrible to contemplate. And if you haven't seen Cabaret, I highly recommend it. It's an amazing musical. Just brace yourself, because it is like one of the most depressing musicals ever made. because the end of Cabaret ends with the total takeover of Germany and the emergence of Nazi Germany under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. Now, Nazi Germany combined all of the worst aspects of both fascist Italy and Soviet Russia. It combined the ideology of fascist Italy with the terror of the Soviet state. Now, the Nazis were National Socialists. They believed in a socialist state dedicated to the advancement of the German people, and the individual exists only to serve the state, as it's directed by their leader, Adolf Hitler. Now, in fascist Italy, the thing is that, well, it goes like this. If your goal is to build a socialist state dedicated to one nation, if you're going to build a socialist state dedicated to the Italian people, if you're going to build a socialist state dedicated to the German people, then it gets to be really important. Like, what exactly is an Italian? What exactly is a German? Now, Mussolini didn't really care about this. Mussolini had a pretty expansive definition on what an Italian was. Pretty much, if you lived inside Italy, you were an Italian. If you spoke Italian, even badly, you were an Italian. That's what Mussolini was interested in. But Hitler had a very, very different vision of what constituted a German. He had an explicitly racial view of what constituted a German, and he explains this in his book, Mein Kampf. He argues that the Germans have a special and unique destiny because they are racially superior to all other peoples on Earth. German was a race of people. In fact, it was a subset of a racially superior group of Europeans, collectively known as the Aryans. If you weren't Aryan, you were an Untermensch. You were subhuman. You weren't really a person. And the goal of the Nazi state is therefore to promote the German race. And this is the part they borrow from the Soviets. Ultimately, their goal is to create a racially pure Aryan utopia. Soviet Russia wants to create the workers' utopia. Nazi Germany wants to create this racial utopia. And just like the Soviets, any price would be paid to bring that utopia into existence. And Hitler studied how Stalin had killed millions of people to bring Soviet Russia into existence. But there is a problem with this ideology. In fact, there's a huge problem with this ideology. Okay, so Germans are this like racially superior group of people, okay? All right. But like if the Germans are so racially superior, why don't they already rule the world? All right. If the Germans are so racially better than anybody else, then why did they struggle to build Germany for like 300 years? All right. If the Germans are smarter and stronger and better looking and more moral than anybody else, then why did the German economy collapse twice in the last 20 years? It collapsed after World War I, and then it collapsed in the Great Depression. Like, if the Germans are like so awesome, if they're so racially superior to everybody else, why did they lose World War I? Okay. But Hitler had an answer for that. I'm going to tell you right now, things are about to get really dark because Hitler's answer was there was a conspiracy to keep the Germans down. There was a secret organization designed to suppress, weaken, and ultimately destroy the German race. And this secret conspiracy was led by the Jew. The Jewish people were the enemy of the German people. And for centuries, for generations, the Jewish people had undermined and secretly plotted and secretly planned to break up and destroy the German people. They controlled the banks. They controlled the industry. They controlled the money. And it was the Jew that kept the German down. Told you it was going to get pretty dark. So when Hitler comes to power, he begins to pass laws restricting Jewish people, controlling what they could do, saying where they could go and what they could do, who they could marry and who they could adopt. And collectively, this group of anti-Semitic laws become known as the Nuremberg Laws. And his goal is to create a category of second-class citizens. And you can see it in the newspaper on the left. Hitler deprives Jews of citizenship rights and bans intermarriage. So the Jews in Germany are restricted. They can only work certain jobs. They're only allowed to go to certain places. They're only allowed to do certain things. They have to wear a yellow star so people can identify them. They're not allowed to marry anyone they fall in love with. And in fact, the Nuremberg laws created this really kind of complex organization. I mean, you can see it in the chart right up above my little yellow box, right up there, that, exactly like what constitutes a Jew, whether a half Jew can marry a full-blooded German, how much Jewish you can have in you before you can marry. And the answer is, I think, 1/8. And people are really shocked by the Nuremberg laws. And America in particular is like, that is absolutely horrible what you're doing to the Jews in Germany. But Hitler throws it right back in America's face, because Hitler goes, I based the Nuremberg laws, I just copied them off of what the South is doing to African Americans. The Nuremberg laws are really just a renamed version of the Jim Crow South. Like Mussolini, Hitler dismantled democracy from within. After he was elected in 1932 and he took office in 1933, Hitler shuts down democratic processes and he eventually rules with absolute power. In fact, Hitler basically borrowed a lot of Mussolini's playbook. Like Mussolini, he stops wearing politician suits and begins wearing military uniforms. He begins to replace his own name with a title, but he's not going to be El Duce, that's Italian. He's going to be the leader, Der Führer. But like Stalin, Hitler adopted an approach where the individual exists only to serve the state, and where unwanted people will be liquidated in order to achieve the goals of this new racist Nazi state, as defined and directed by the leader, Der Führer. Nazi Germany had become a nightmarish country, the like of which had never been seen before in world history. Nazi Germany was a racist death cult committed to world conquest. And this program for world conquest begins with Nazi Germany expanding across Central Europe. In 1936, Hitler rejects the Treaty of Versailles, and he begins a rapid rearmament program, building hundreds of tanks and planes and submarines and warships. He rebuilds that huge German army, which had been disbanded at the end of World War I, back in 1918. He seizes an area of Germany called the Rhineland, and it was supposed to be demilitarized in 1918 to prevent another Great War from breaking out. And Hitler takes a bet. He's betting that the Great Depression has so damaged France and Britain that they don't have the military strength or the economic wealth to oppose this expansion across Central Europe. And he is correct. And his success only encourages him. And in 1938, he seizes the whole of Austria, which was a German country which largely welcomed its annexation into Germany proper. This is followed by the seizure of an entire neighboring country of Czechoslovakia, which is kind of gobbled up in pieces throughout 1938 and into 1939. And the Western democracies did nothing. France and Britain were simply too weak. They didn't have the military, they didn't have the economic wealth to oppose any of this. So they largely did nothing. But it's actually, they did something worse than nothing. They blessed the expansion of Nazi Germany. And this is the policy known as Chamberlain's appeasement. And it's named after that guy right up above me, Neville Chamberlain. He's the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And Neville Chamberlain knows that France and Britain don't have the military strength, they don't have the economic wealth to oppose Germany. So Chamberlain tries to cut a deal. And there he is on the lower left, cutting a deal, shaking hands with Adolf Hitler. And Chamberlain's idea is that he's going to give away parts of other people's countries in an attempt to satisfy Hitler's ambition. He doesn't think he's really interested in world conquest to build a German racial utopia. That's just craziness talking, because he didn't think Hitler was that crazy. But I mean, we know now that like he totally was. But at any rate, as Neville Chamberlain gave away parts of other people's countries, he thought he had succeeded. He thought he had appeased Hitler. And he gets this agreement signed by Adolf Hitler. He comes back to England and he has this big conference, and there he is right up above me holding that agreement, saying, "This is peace in our time. We are not going to have to worry about a second world war. I, Neville Chamberlain, have prevented that war from happening." And of course, he couldn't have been more wrong. And people are really impressed with this expansion of Nazi Germany, especially Imperial Japan on the other side of the world. Imperial Japan was deeply impressed with the growth and power of the Nazi state, and they began to adopt a lot of these Nazi ideas into Japanese culture. Indeed, they sought to remake Imperial Japan into a lesser and Asian version of Nazi Germany. Imperial Japan began to see itself as kind of like a super race. And they're like, look, if the Germans are building a racial utopia in Europe, if they're the racially superior people of Europe, then Japan must be the racially superior people of Asia. Japan began to see itself as a kind of super race, and the people around Japan, Koreans, Chinese, Mongolians, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Indonesians, these people are just Untermenschen. They're subhuman. They're not really people at all. And Japan slowly duplicates the Nazi system in Asia, and it creates its own racist death cult on the other side of the world. And by 1936, the Japanese military had basically gained total control over Japan itself and steered it towards greater and greater cooperation with Nazi Germany. The Nazis and the Japanese got along just fine. They got along so well that they actually signed a military agreement. And there it is on the lower left, the military agreement between Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. Three of the most violent and aggressive countries ever known from world history. And very few people object to this in Japan. Most people are scared of the Japanese military and do not want to challenge it. There's only one man, a lonely voice of reason and dissent, that begins to speak out against this, that says, look, this is not a good idea. Nazi Germany is a racist death cult. This isn't going to end well for them. And that man was the samurai admiral, Isuroku Yamamoto. And there he is on the left. Yamamoto says, look, Nazi Germany is not the future. Nazi Germany is not going to build a racial utopia in Europe. Something very, very bad is going to happen to them. We don't need to duplicate them. They are not the future. Yamamoto argued that Japan doesn't need to make friends with the Germans. Japan needs to make friends with the Americans. Yamamoto says the Americans are the future. The Americans know the way out of the Great Depression. The Americans are going to lead the world. It is the Americans and the liberal democracy of America that is going to be the best friend of Japan for generation after generation. And Yamamoto actually has to be smuggled out of Japan because the military starts planning his assassination and execution because he won't stop criticizing the new allies of Nazi Germany. In fact, this is why he spends so much time at sea, because the choices are we either had to send Yamamoto abroad or he was going to get executed in Japan itself. But Yamamoto is, of course, going to be completely correct, and he's going to be proven correct in the most ugly and dramatic way imaginable. Because all of these horrible nations, all of these aggressive, violent countries began to put their policies into action. And they began to start war after war after war. And all of these little wars will eventually combine into a single massive global conflict. We're going to talk about that next time. And I will see you there.